Good evening. Welcome to our third story in the Elven Sanctuaries, the Labyrinth of Echoes. Let's begin. The air inside the labyrinth was cold, heavy, and alive with a quiet hum that seemed to resonate through the very stone of the walls. Orlen's footsteps echoed softly as he moved cautiously forward, the corridor ahead dimly lit by a faint, shifting glow that pulsed along the runes carved into the black stone. The passage twisted and turned unpredictably, its sharp angles and narrow pathways giving the disconcerting impression of being inside a living thing. The ring in Orlen's pocket pulsed with steady warmth, its rhythm syncing eerily with the glow of the runes, as though guiding him deeper into the labyrinth's heart. His breath misted in the cool air, and every sound, his footsteps, the soft rustle of his cloak, the faint whisper of his breath, seemed amplified, bouncing off the smooth walls and disappearing into the unknown. One step at a time, he muttered to himself, his voice low and tremulous. His mind raced with thoughts of the others, Sirana, Adric, and Kalen, each now walking their own path through this maze of shadows and secrets. He wondered what trials they faced, what fears the labyrinth had conjured to test their resolve. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a circular chamber whose floor was inlaid with intricate patterns of silver and gold, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. The walls stretched upward, their surfaces etched with runes that seemed to shift and flow as Orlen approached. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a small crystalline orb, its surface swirling with a soft inner light. The warmth of the ring in Orlen's pocket intensified as he stepped closer, its pulse quickening in a way that filled him with equal parts curiosity and dread. As he reached out to touch the orb, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and resonant, yet somehow familiar. "Do you seek answers or merely escape?" it asked, the words vibrating through the air like a distant thunderclap. Orlen froze, his hand hovering inches above the orb, his heart pounding in his chest. He began, his voice catching in his throat. "I seek the truth, about the relics, about what lies ahead." The voice responded not with words, but with a wave of light that emanated from the orb, enveloping the room in a soft glow. Images began to form in the air around Orlen, fragmented scenes that flickered and shifted like reflections on water. He saw a sprawling city of white stone, its towers gleaming in the sunlight, its streets filled with figures both familiar and strange. He saw the Pillar of Morning, standing solitary in a barren landscape, its runes glowing brighter than he remembered. And he saw the labyrinth itself, its walls twisting and reshaping, its center shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The images vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Orlen alone once more, the room dim and silent except for the faint hum of the orb. "You carry the burden of choice," the voice said, softer now, yet still resonating with an undeniable weight. "The relics you bear are keys, but they will not unlock every door. What lies ahead will require more than courage. It will demand sacrifice." Orlen's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the orb, the weight of the voice's words settling heavily in his chest. He looked around the chamber, his gaze lingering on the shifting runes, the glowing patterns on the floor, and the orb that pulsed faintly like a living heart. "Sacrifice," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What kind of sacrifice?" The voice did not answer, and the silence that followed was absolute. As Orlen turned to leave the chamber, the air grew colder, and the runes along the walls flared briefly before dimming once more. The corridor beyond the chamber stretched endlessly into the dark, its sharp turns and narrow passages disorienting in their sameness. Orlen moved carefully, the ring in his pocket guiding him with its steady pulse, though each step seemed to draw him deeper into the labyrinth's mysteries. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by creatures or spirits, but by the labyrinth itself, as though it were aware of his every thought and movement. He rounded another corner and found himself in a narrow passage where the walls glowed faintly with a deep blue light, their surfaces etched with jagged angular runes unlike those he had seen before. The air here felt heavier, pressing against him with an almost physical force, and the hum of the labyrinth grew louder, resonating in his chest like the toll of a distant bell. The passage led to another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less imposing. In its center stood a stone table, upon which lay a fragment of something that glowed faintly. A shard of dark crystal, its surface cracked and veined with light. As Orlen approached the table, the shard flared suddenly, its glow filling the chamber with an intense light. Images flooded his mind, the faces of his companions, each walking their own path through the labyrinth, the shadowy pursuers they had evaded since Green Hill Vale, and the pillar of morning, its light growing dimmer as shadows closed in around it. The images faded, and Orlen staggered back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The shard's glow softened, and the hum of the labyrinth quieted, leaving the room steeped in an oppressive stillness. Taking a deep breath, Orlen reached for the shard, its surface cool and smooth beneath his fingers. As he lifted it from the table, the room began to shift, the walls shimmering and blurring as though the labyrinth itself was reacting to his actions. The passage behind him began to glow faintly, its runes pulsing in a steady rhythm that matched the warmth of the shard in his hand. Orlen clutched the fragment tightly, his resolve hardening as he stepped back into the corridor. He didn't know where the labyrinth would lead him next, but he knew one thing for certain: the truth he sought was somewhere ahead, and there was no turning back. The corridor stretched endlessly before Orlen, the blue light of the labyrinth's runes flickering like distant stars against the dark stone walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with an almost tangible tension that pressed against his chest and slowed his breath. The shard in his hand pulsed faintly, its cool surface radiating a subtle energy that seemed to resonate with the labyrinth itself. The further he walked, the more the hum of the walls deepened, transforming into a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to echo through his very bones. Orlen's thoughts raced as he clutched the shard tightly, the fragmented images it had shown him still flashing in his mind, the faces of his companions, the encroaching shadows, and the dimming light of the pillar of morning. The labyrinth was testing him, of that he was certain, but its purpose remained elusive, shrouded in layers of mystery that seemed to deepen with every turn. The passageway narrowed suddenly, the walls closing in around him until the air felt stifling, almost suffocating. Orlen ducked slightly to avoid a low-hanging arch of jagged stone, his movements careful and deliberate as he pressed forward. The runes along the walls shifted as he passed, their light growing dimmer, their patterns twisting into unfamiliar shapes. A faint sound echoed through the corridor, a distant whisper, too soft to discern but persistent enough to quicken his pulse. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the labyrinth in its wake. Orlen tightened his grip on the shard, its steady pulse the only reassurance he had as he continued down the path. The passage opened into another chamber, this one smaller and more confined, its walls adorned with runes that pulsed with an unsettling red glow. The air here was colder, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Orlen's stomach churn. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, Its surface cracked and uneven, and upon it rested a ring of dark metal, its edges sharp and jagged. Its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. The shard in Orlen's hand grew warmer as he approached, its pulse quickening in a way that mirrored the beat of his own heart. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ring, a sense of unease settling over him like a heavy cloak. As he reached out to touch the ring, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and distorted, its words dripping with malice. "You seek what you do not understand," it said, the sound reverberating through the room. Orlen froze, his hand hovering inches above the ring, his breath caught in his throat. "I don't seek power," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I seek the truth about the relics and why they chose us." The voice laughed, a harsh and grating sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Truth is a burden, little one," it said, "and burdens break even the strongest of wills." The runes along the walls flared brightly, their red glow filling the chamber with a harsh, unrelenting light. Shadows began to coalesce at the edges of the room, their forms twisting and shifting as they moved toward him. Orlen stepped back instinctively, his hand tightening around the shard as he prepared to defend himself. The shadows stopped just short of the pedestal, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their presence radiating a suffocating sense of dread. "Prove your resolve," the voice commanded, its tone sharper now, like the crack of a whip. "Take the ring, or leave this place and abandon your quest." Orlen's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the ring, its dark surface gleaming ominously in the light of the runes. The shard in his hand pulsed steadily, its warmth spreading through him like a quiet reassurance. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand closing around the ring. The instant he touched it, the world around him shifted violently, the chamber dissolving into a storm of light and shadow. He felt a surge of energy course through him, overwhelming and disorienting, as the rune's light merged with the ring's power. The shadows around him shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving into the walls as the storm subsided. When the light faded, Orlen found himself back in the corridor, the ring now resting in his palm alongside the shard. Its surface was no longer jagged, but smooth and cool, its symbols faint and subdued. The air around him was calmer now, the oppressive weight of the labyrinth eased, though the sense of purpose it instilled remained. Orlen slipped the ring into his pocket alongside the shard, their combined warmth a steady presence as he continued forward. The corridor ahead glowed faintly, the blue light of the runes guiding him toward what he hoped would be the labyrinth's heart. As he walked, the corridor began to widen, its walls curving outward until they formed a vast, open space illuminated by a soft, golden glow. The chamber before him was unlike any he had seen, its floor inlaid with intricate mosaics that depicted scenes of battles, triumphs, and losses, all tied to the relics and their enigmatic purpose. In the center of the room stood a massive archway, its surface carved with runes that shimmered faintly in the golden light. Beyond the arch lay a darkness so profound that it seemed to swallow the light around it, a void that pulsed faintly with an unseen energy. Orlen hesitated at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the archway. The ring and shard in his pocket grew warmer, their pulse quickening as though urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the arch, the golden light of the chamber dimming as the darkness reached out to meet him. "The truth lies ahead," he whispered to himself, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "And I'll face it, whatever it may be." The darkness beyond the archway swallowed Orlen whole. The golden glow of the chamber behind him fading into nothingness as the oppressive void closed around him. The air was heavy, thick with an unearthly quiet that seemed to muffle even his own breath. The shard and the ring in his pocket pulsed faintly, their warmth the only anchor in a world that felt otherwise untethered from reality. Orlen took a cautious step forward, his boots making no sound against a floor he couldn't see, but somehow felt beneath him. The void was absolute, yet as his eyes adjusted, faint shapes began to emerge, twisting lines, jagged patterns, and distant lights that flickered like stars in the farthest reaches of the abyss. A low hum resonated through the void, vibrating in his chest and filling his mind with an eerie sense of anticipation. The path ahead was not clear, but the relic's steady pulse urged him onward, their rhythms syncing with the hum of the labyrinth itself. As Orlen moved deeper into the darkness, the shapes around him grew more distinct, coalescing into towering walls etched with runes that glowed faintly like embers. The runes flickered in and out, their patterns shifting as though alive, and Orlen realized with a shiver that they seemed to be responding to his presence. The hum of the labyrinth deepened, transforming into a low, resonant chant that echoed from unseen corners of the void. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, but it carried a weight that pressed heavily against Orlen's thoughts, as if testing his resolve with every step. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, though his voice faltered as the words left his lips. The runes flared briefly, their light intensifying, and the chant grew louder before subsiding once more. The path narrowed, the walls closing in on either side, and Orlen felt a claustrophobic unease creep into his chest. The air grew colder, and with each step the runes' glow dimmed until they were little more than faint traces of light against the black stone. Orlen's pulse quickened as the void pressed closer, and he found himself reaching instinctively for the shard in his pocket. Its warmth was reassuring, but the faint pulse had changed, its rhythm erratic and uneven, as though mirroring his own uncertainty. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. He rounded a corner and froze, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stood a massive figure, its form cloaked in shadow but unmistakably humanoid. It towered over him, its presence radiating an aura of power and stillness that made the air around it feel heavy and unyielding. Its eyes, twin points of burning light, fixed on Orlen with an intensity that pierced through his very soul. "You seek the truth," the figure said, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the labyrinth. Orlen swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the shard in his pocket. "I do," he said, his voice trembling but determined. The figure tilted its head slightly as though considering his words. "The truth is not given freely," it said. "It is earned through sacrifice and resolve. Do you possess the strength to bear it?" Orlen hesitated, his mind racing. The labyrinth had tested him at every turn, forcing him to confront his fears and doubts. But now he stood at its heart, face to face with something he could not fully comprehend. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try." The figure's burning eyes narrowed and the air around them grew colder. "Then let the labyrinth judge," it said, raising a hand wreathed in shadow. The runes on the walls flared to life, their light cascading through the void and forming a circle of glowing patterns around Orlen's feet. The hum of the labyrinth intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo that filled his mind with 1,000 overlapping voices. The ground beneath Orlen shifted, and he stumbled as the circle of light expanded, transforming into a vast glowing mosaic that depicted scenes of battles, triumphs, and losses. He saw the faces of his companions, Sirana, her blade flashing as she faced shadowy adversaries. Adric, his staff glowing brightly as he wove spells to protect himself. Kalen, his expression one of quiet determination as he navigated a maze of twisting corridors. The images shifted, showing Orlen himself standing before the pillar of mourning, the relics in his hands glowing with an intensity that rivaled the sun. The voices of the labyrinth grew louder, their words incomprehensible but charged with meaning, and Orlen felt a surge of energy course through him, both exhilarating and terrifying. The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form looming over Orlen, and the light of the mosaic dimmed. "The relics have chosen you," it said, its voice quieter now but no less commanding. "But choice alone is not enough. Will you carry their burden, knowing the cost it will demand?" Orlen's mind raced as the weight of the question pressed down on him. He thought of Greenhill Vale, of the quiet life he had left behind, of the friends he had made and the dangers they had faced together. He thought of the pillar, the labyrinth, and the truths that still lay hidden. "I will," he said at last, his voice steady. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I'll see it through." The figure regarded him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then the labyrinth accepts you," it said, its voice reverberating with finality. The light of the runes surged, filling the void with a brilliance that forced Orlen to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the figure was gone, and Orlen stood alone in a wide corridor bathed in soft, golden light. The shard and the ring in his pocket pulsed in unison, their warmth filling him with a quiet sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear now, its walls adorned with runes that glowed steadily, their patterns guiding him toward the labyrinth's exit. As Orlen stepped forward, the hum of the labyrinth faded into silence, replaced by the faint sound of wind and the rustle of leaves. The air grew warmer, and the darkness began to lift, giving way to the soft glow of starlight filtering through the trees. He emerged into a vast forest clearing, the Veilwood's familiar canopy stretching overhead, and saw his companions waiting for him, their faces a mixture of relief and quiet determination. "You made it," Sirana said, her voice calm but laced with an unspoken question. Orlen nodded, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the first hints of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "We all did," he said softly, "man. And the journey isn't over yet."